Hello, I'm Amro. This is actually my second presentation as Agya co-president. So I'm Agya co-president representing the Arab world side, and my colleague Mahmoud is representing the German side. But I'm taking his role today because he's not around, and it's an honor to be doing this. I just have to say that when I first started with Agya, when we were in Beirut, actually, that's where if you remember that, who was there, it was like the Last Supper, before everything just went down. and I do remember just prior to that, actually, was that the magic word that I realized in the interview that was interdisciplinary. And I thought I saw that on the Agya website, and I saw that in the discussion. But when we got really serious, they really meant interdisciplinary. Like it was almost like other websites, other universities, institutes have it like a token word that you do because it's pretty, like, sustainability and all that. But it was interdisciplinary that really defined the ethos and the philosophy of Agya, and for good reason too. So let us just go through this very short presentation. So Agya is consisted of, encompasses 23 countries from Morocco to Iraq, and it's that one mission that tries to elevate the excellence and scholarship between them all, between Germany and the Arab world, and between Arab countries throughout the region. So the Arab Young Academy of Sciences and Humanities brings together excellent scholars from the Arab world and Germany to face challenges to develop solutions through research cooperation. So whatever's facing us in the world today, from the contentious politics down to the climate change, we are always bringing it up. We're always discussing it to try and find the optimal, if not solution, but working on a problem to get where we are today. And it has been very, very rewarding. And I've only been here like 2 years, and there's more to go. And for anyone who's been here longer can tell you the richness of it as well, even prior to that, of the activities that have taken place. So it was established in 2013 as the first bilateral young academy worldwide. Currently, it has more than 60 Agya members and 55 alumni. They're affiliated with more than 80 prominent universities and research institutes, which are located in 19 countries. From all fields of the life, natural, social sciences, the technical sciences, the humanities, and the arts. Members are selected in a highly competitive selection process for 5-year competition. In relation to the format and content of its academic activities, Agya is independent. And Agya is actually a very peculiar phenomenon because it really combines the best from the university sector and the public realm to try and bring something to in a cultural production and knowledge production that is of benefit to society. So the main goals of Agya is interdisciplinary research, capacity building and promotion of high potentials, research-oriented policy advice, and networking building and scientific cooperation. The Agya General Assemblies, which take place twice a year, are part of the Agya annual conferences. Agya members discuss and decide on future research projects and joint initiatives. One a year, they elect the steering committee, which I became a member of the second time. So organized in collaboration with cooperation partners in the Arab world and Germany. Opportunity to exchange ideas and establish networks with outstanding scientists and high-ranking representatives from academia, politics, and the media. So these consist of the Agya steering committee. It's 3 Arab and 3 German democratically elected members. They coordinate all activities of Agya and represent the interests of all Agya members. We represent Agya regularly at international conferences and actively engage in exchanges with leading academic institutes in the Arab world and Germany. And the co-president is myself and Mahmoud, as I discussed before, and that picture of me is very, very old. I think I should update it, but if you want to see a 5-year-old picture of me there, I'm happy to go along with that one. So the Agya Advisory Board consists of Arab representatives and German representatives. The Agya administration supports for the research activities of the Academy and its members is provided by Agya office in Berlin and the Agya regional office in Cairo, as well as the Agya regional coordinators in Beirut and Tunis, who do a fantastic job. The Agya funding consists of 15 million euros for 5 years, 2020 to 2025, by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. Additional funding by several Arab and German cooperation partners also is a source of funding, as well as individual Agya annual conferences are also supported by cooperation institutions in the Arab world. The Agya research formats and areas, it's the very vital part and really is the metaphysical blueprint of Agya, which are the working group projects and meetings, the tandem and alumni projects, idea competition, and research mobility program. Working groups include the Arab and German education, the common heritage and common challenges, the dynamics of transformation, energy, water and environment, health and society, and innovation. The Agya Working Group, Common Heritage and Common Challenges, which you've gotten a very strong feel for, I hope by now, is the group that aims at achieving a deeper understanding and raising awareness of processes of Arab-German cultural exchanges, relevant working group events and project outcomes during the last week, which will include, if they have not included yet, the international workshop and book launch, The Forms of Migration, public event, Access to Access, it's always a tongue twister, that one. Book launch and international workshop, Thinking Through Ruins. And for more information on the working group, you can visit the website addressed there. And the benefits of Agya membership is that it allows you to implement innovative Arab-German research projects, conduct research at the interface of science and society, increase your professional visibility and inter-regional mobility, receive project funding and administrative support, master intercultural and interdisciplinary research, benefit from tailor-made training opportunities, and an access to an international network of distinguished researchers and innovators. And I should say that the Agya staff do a fantastic job. I mean, even though we're the scholars and we're doing this, they're also scholars in their own right, by the way, but the work they do is amazing, given that in Germany there's a lot of bureaucracy, but they just know how to magically handle this part of the Agya aspect of it. And the eligibility for membership includes, you have to have a PhD, preferably, but not awarded, it's always flexible, but preferably awarded no less than 3 and no more than 10 years ago, an affiliation with a university or research institute in Germany or in any Arab country. Proven record of highest research excellence in the field of specialization, in your field of specialization, and interest in interdisciplinary research, in an international environment. So very strong potential for academic leadership and proficiency in English, as this is the working language of Agya. The Agya communication channels include the agya.info, and you can also follow Agya on Facebook and Twitter, and receive the regular digital newsletter. And you can also turn to our project videos, which are on the Agya YouTube channel. So we are everywhere. And the Agya the call for Agya membership, it opens up next month, and we're looking forward to your application. And it really is, if you are one of those who qualify, we really hope you can join us. It's a very enriching community. It's a family. And well, despite the fact that we had the pandemic, we still managed to work miracles under situations of Zoom and Jitsi calls. And it's really rewarding. And hopefully we'll get to do more physical activities like this in the I won't say post-pandemic, because I honestly don't know when this will end, but even through it, we will manage to the best we can. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Amro. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and for those online. My name is Enass Khansa. I'm an Agya member, and I'm one of the editors of this fabulous project, Thinking Through Ruins. Thank you all. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Francisco Prado-Vilar. Thank you for taking the time and making the trip to come here. Francisco is a distinguished researcher at the University of Santiago de Compostela with the research group Syncresis. Before that, he held positions at Harvard University, at Princeton, Stanford, and the University of London. I also know Francisco as the director of this very important project that is ongoing since 2015, and it's the Andrew W. Mellon restoration project of the Portal of Glory of Santiago de Compostela. This project has meetings and fellowships and conferences, but also it has already 2 books out. And the first book is entitled The Portal of Glory, Architecture, Matter, and Vision. And it's already out online, open access. And there is a new book coming out shortly. And the title is The Portal of Glory, Restoration, Polychromy, and the Transfiguration of Matter. It also will be open access. And I just heard that there will be a 3rd book. So congratulations, Francisco. Today, you will be speaking to us about your new research project, which is on photography in the Spanish Civil War. And you'll be reflecting on the topic of this conference and the contribution that you participated in the past 2 days. So thank you again. Please join me in welcoming Francisco Prado-Vilar.
Well, thank you so much, Enass. So wonderful to see you again. One of the fellows, the Mellon fellows in this project on the Santiago Cathedral. She brought all the literature and the context of the connection between Santiago and Al-Andalus, which there are very interesting, even artistic connections with the Cathedral of Santiago. Well, thank you, Enass and Constantin, for inviting me, Agya, this wonderful center, for hosting the event of Thinking Through Ruins. And thank you to all the members of this really inspiring workshop, Thinking Through Ruins, and congratulations on the amazing book you just put out. It's beautiful outside and it's very inspiring, the contributions in the book. So I'm sure we'll learn a lot from that. So in this lecture, I propose a reflection on Iberian ruins in the form of a journey through several images that will lead us to an in-depth analysis of what is arguably the most important political painting of the 20th century, and one that is inspired by ruins, Picasso's Guernica. Let's see. Which will appear in a moment, not yet the Guernica, but something related to what I was going to say. Well, let's just go with the Guernica. Oh, now it's working. So, as the title indicates, Guernica, Picasso found inspiration for the painting in the photographs of the aftermath of the air raids that destroyed the Basque city of Guernica on 26 April 1937, conducted by German planes of the Condor Legion in order to aid a military uprising led by General Franco against the government of the Republic. As we will see, if we delve in the visual archaeology of Guernica, excavating the layers of its formal configuration in relation to Picasso's vital trajectory, we will discover that there emerge in the painting other ruins from the historical and mythical substratum of the Iberian Peninsula and the Mediterranean. Let us begin with the painting on screen, an allegory of the sense of touch, by Spanish Baroque artist José Rivera, where a blind man examines with his hands the broken head of a classical statue. He's not able to see with his eyes, but he's able to see through the sensation of his fingers that allows him to visualize the object in his mind. The light that illuminates his head conveys the active process of his thought and interior vision. One could say that this is the way ruins compel us to experience them, by touching the fragments of the past, feeling their material presence, using our imagination to retrieve the original appearance, and using our analytical and literary powers to tell stories about them, their origin and their process and causes of their destruction. This is the case of, for example, the ruins of al-Zahra, the city palace built in 940 by the first Umayyad Caliph of Cordoba, Abd-al-Rahman III, and destroyed in 1110 during the civil war that followed the fall of the Caliphate. The ruins soon became the theme of a whole genre of poetry of loss and nostalgia soon after the city was destroyed. And into the late 19th century, the ruins were discovered and photographs, and the excavation began at the beginning of the 20th century. You see photographs there and how soon postcards were done, and it started a whole new nostalgia about the ruins of this peak of the political power of the Cordoban Caliphate in Spain at the beginning of the 20th century. And this is the case of the ruins of Guernica on the other spectrum of the geography and the multiculturalism of the Iberian Peninsula, which gave rise to works of a recontextualization of the ruins, the most important of which is Picasso's Guernica. Both in the case of the fall of the Caliphate in Madinat al-Zahra, in the case of the Spanish Civil War, the destruction of cities, cultural heritage, and ruins were the center of a symbolic and political discourse that tried to appropriate ruins in different ways. And it is in the context of the Spanish Civil War when this haunting photograph was taken. We see a soldier looking defiantly at the camera, whereas in the painting by Rivera, the ray of light illuminates the calm process of thought and is an allegory of his interior vision. In the photograph, the light is blinding the soldier, almost as an allegory of the fact that he does not see, although biologically, physically, his eyes can see or care about the bust he's holding. The blind man is aware of the value of the ruin. The soldier prefers to be in the dark. He feels exposed. It appears as if he were caught by the enemy or an intruder just at a moment when he's carrying out a bad deed, like the destruction of a sacred image. The defiant and angry look at the camera, showing not to care about the recovery of a precious object, but rather it seems like it's the aftermath of a destruction, as if the soldier were a slayer, a sort of David, holding as a trophy the head of the giant he has just killed, as in this painting that we see here by Alessandro Turci. There is almost an incidental pose that reflects our history in the photographs. And this is, you have a case in the Spanish Civil War where in the context of the attacks by anarchists and Marxists onto religious images, some religious images were destroyed. However, the photo represents just the contrary. It's not actually an anarchist destroying a sacred image, but it's actually a soldier from the other side, the Franco led military, showing one of the fragments from an image of St. Peter apparently destroyed by the Reds, is how they call the Franco side of the Civil War to the actual Republican government military. They call them the Reds for Marxism, communism, and anarchists. And here, actually, this photograph belongs to an archive of photographs produced and distributed by Franco in their propaganda efforts to show that they were heralding civilization against the destruction done by the Reds. In that same folder archive, there are images such as this crucified Christ found in the trenches, where apparently the anarchists kind of defiled the image by raising the arm in a Marxist salute. And that was part of the propaganda images distributed by Franco. And what you see here in the fluctuation of these photographs between someone who, if we don't have a context for it, must be a destroyer or must be a preserver or must be both in the context of the Spanish Civil War, will lead me to another destroyer that also created something related to ruins, to cultural heritage, and that inspired this work that we'll be looking at from a different perspective today, which is the Guernica. And Picasso used to say that a picture used to be a sum of additions. In my case, a picture is a sum of destructions. I do a picture, then I destroy it. In the end, though, nothing is lost. The red I took away from one place turns up somewhere else. And we will see how that happens in Guernica and the way Picasso recovers and destroys ruins in the archaeological substratum of the Iberian Peninsula. Here is what we'll be looking out, and we will leave actually Madinat al-Zahra in the background, but to see that Madinat al-Zahra is also a city constructed on multiple layers of ruins leading back to classical antiquity, which is where this analysis of Guernica will lead us. You'll see there Roman sarcophagi and sculptures, such as this sarcophagus, representing, decorated with the myth of Meleager, or that small sculpture representing Hercules, that were part of the decoration of Madinat al-Zahra and that were recovered in the excavations. So in order to approach this analysis of Guernica, I invite you to travel back in time to 1941 and sit next to these Harvard students as they contemplate Guernica in the Barbour Room of the Fog Museum at Harvard. Picasso once said that he represented Spain in exile, and the same could be said for Guernica in its American journey. It is an errant painting, or a painting errant like Don Quixote, owned by a government that no longer existed because it had been commissioned by the Ministry of Culture of the Republic of Spain for the Spanish pavilion of the Paris World Fair of 1937. And with the fall of the Republic 2 years later, Guernica was bound to wander through cities and museums as a witness to the tragedy of a country torn apart by civil war. MoMA in New York was its adopted home. And to his director, Alfred Barr, the director of the Fog Museum, Paul Sachs, wrote an impassioned letter in January 1940, inquiring about the possibility of bringing the huge canvas to Harvard. Dear Alfred, I was so much impressed by the power and beauty of the Guernica when I saw it in New York that I secretly hoped it might be possible one day to show it here at the Fog. So Picasso's canvas arrived in the Fog in 1941 and was exhibited in the company of other fragments from monuments ruined during the European wars, including some Spanish exiles, as we will see, in an installation that poignantly captured its tragic genealogy and activated its power as a witness to history and a nexus linking history and the present to the time of myth, a myth that will be buried in ruins. Indeed, it was mounted on a series of 12th century Roman capitals coming from the ruins of the Burgundian Abbey of Moutier-Saint-Jean, which had been acquired by the Fog Museum in 1922 on the advice of the very important Harvard art historian and medievalist, Arthur Kingsley Porter. Porter had been involved, actually, a part of the international team of scholars participating in the Commission des Monuments Historiques, created by the French government after World War I to document works of art that had been partially destroyed by the Germans. And there is a whole file of these wonderful photographs, actually, from the destruction of World War I. And I want you to look at the side faces of the capitals supporting Guernica. And these are the side faces. The side faces were decorated with scenes of towns being destroyed by the forces of evil. And then they curiously established a series of thematic and formal echoes with the painting. Picasso's cubist deconstruction of Guernica on the photograph on the top is anticipated in the Romanesque microarchitecture, formed by a juxtaposition of geometric shapes distributed in cubes in arches. Both in the painting and the capitals, we see characters looking up in horror, while a woman in both extends her arm out of a window in the second floor of a building. See, here, looking up. It's curiously how unintended these connections might be from one ruin to the other. A demon, for example, if in the Guernica bombings destroy Guernica, here demons are destroying the buildings also. And people are looking up. It's not bombs, but the Satan who is destroying the same type of tragic architecture. And we have also a wonderful set of configurations in this exhibition of Guernica, and it's this work which originally belonged to the Cathedral of Santiago and was a gift to Harvard by the Spanish Republic in exchange for another work that the Folk Museum had acquired in kind of like problematic terms, and that the government of the Spanish Republic, in their efforts to bring back to Spain cultural heritage, claimed to Harvard that funerary lead of an important nobleman from the 12th century in Spain. So there was an agreement in which Harvard and the Republican government agreed to do this exchange. And as Guernica was exhibited in this room, where the Republic was no longer present, the Guernica was next to this gift of the Spanish absent republic, destroyed republic. And to this day, this column is exhibited at Harvard with a label saying that it was a gift of the Spanish Republic. So here, the Guernica of Picasso met ruins from other wars of European history and also a fellow exile from the destroyed republic. Curiously enough, one of the last great events, cultural events in the Spanish Republic was when the funerary lead that they exchanged arrived in the Archaeological Museum in Madrid. And it was a moment in which the Republic showed how they care about cultural heritage, and they show a renewed museum at that moment. Just 3 years later, the headquarters of the National Archaeological Museum, when the Civil War started, would be bombed and would become the headquarters for the efforts of the Republic to inventory all the cultural heritage in Madrid and start the huge operation of preservation to saving from the bombings of the Franco military. Here you see all the effort in the National Archaeological Museum, foreign visitors visiting the efforts of the Republic to preserve heritage and bring that to the international community, saying that what Franco said and the side of Franco that they were destroying images and cultural heritage was actually not the case, and they were only isolated moments. But in fact, the Republic was claiming that they were the preservers again of the cultural heritage of Spain, and the Franco military were the barbarians, actually, and the ones bombing Madrid with the Prado Museum paintings and all the different museums. And curiously enough, in this museum, there is the work that is at the core of Picasso's Guernica, which will be following the trajectory today. This Roman sarcophagus decorated with the tragedy of Orestes. It is here in the original setting, and here it is all wrapped up in the moment in which the museum became a kind of bunker where the inventory of cultural heritage was realized. And I want to go back to Harvard because the room where the Guernica was exhibited is called the Barbour Room. And any art historian will know that this is a very important last name because it's the last name of one of the founders of our discipline, Aby Barbour. The room is named after his brother, Felix Barbour. Barbour was a family of bankers, and Felix was very interested in sponsoring art history. Aby Barbour himself was kind of arranging in the 20s a connection between the students of Kingsley Porter and his own students in Harvard, and they were saying how wonderful it would be to bring together the art history of Hamburg and Harvard together. But this never happened. So we would be, if that had happened, we would have in Harvard something similar to the Barbour Institute that now is in London, with this very specific way of looking at art history and image. That didn't happen because Barbour died in 1929 and Kingsley Porter in 1933. But let us imagine that the Harvard students in 41 could be looking at Porter's incredible photographic collection. And this is a photograph of the Oreste sarcophagus from Madrid taken by Porter. And that looking at the Guernica, they could do the type of analysis that we will be engaged today. And just to explain you a little bit, the Barbour approach, Barbour was very much interested in the afterlife and transformation of classical and literary imagery, both at a psychological level, that is in the interior landscape of personal memory, and on a cultural level, in the longue durée of the history of Western civilization. He saw classical figures in what he called pathos formel, a combination of an emotional charge and an iconographic formula as sort of wandering ghosts or gods in exile, exerting a haunting influence over the historical unfolding of Western art. From an epistemological perspective, Barbour rejected discursive exposition and rigid periodization and presented his research in the form of a sort of cartography of images, which materialized in the Mnemosyne project, a builder atlas made up of a succession of photographic montage placed on individual panels covered with black cloth, such as the one you see on screen. So let's just create our own Mnemosyne panel to excavate the visual archaeology of Guernica. And let's start with the sarcophagus. Drawing principally on Aeschylus' famous trilogy, the Oresteia, the sarcophagus represents the revenge of Orestes in his subsequent quest for expiation. The trilogy begins with the departure of Agamemnon to fight the Trojan War and the murder of his daughter, Iphigenia, sacrificed like a goat at the father's command in order to appease Artemis and gather favorable winds to aid the sailing of the Greek fleet. During Agamemnon's absence, his wife Clytemnestra, angered by the death of their daughter, takes up a lover, Aegisthus, and together they plot to usurp the throne. Upon Agamemnon's return, Clytemnestra manages to ensnare him into the bath, entangles him in a robe, and kills him in sacrificial fashion with 3 stabs followed by a prayer to the gods. Fearing that her young son Orestes would grow up and avenge his father, Clytemnestra sends him into exile and keeps her older daughter Electra in a state of near servitude. But at the command of the oracle of Apollo, Orestes returns, meets Electra at the tomb of their father, and together they plot revenge. And this is the point where the story, this is the point in the story that the narrative of the sarcophagus begins. Orestes enters the palace disguised as a messenger, and there he slays his mother and her lover, a crime for which he will be relentlessly tormented by the Furies, the goddesses of revenge. And we see from left to right how the narrative unfolds chronologically in a continuous series of interconnected tableaux, beginning with the peaceful scene of the Furies resting quietly before the crime. Suddenly, in the central section, the drama breaks into an explosive, chiastic movement, springing from the double portrait of Orestes in his murderous rampage, and the slain bodies of Aegisthus toppled from his throne and Clytemnestra. And bracketing emotionally the central scene are two supporting characters, very important. An old nurse who flinches at the violence by covering her face, and a male servant who hides behind a stool next to the corpse of the queen. Its symmetry remains inscrutable even in the context of the Italian Renaissance, where other almost identical Oreste sarcophagi, such as the one on screen, which was housed at the Palazzo Giustiniani, were revered by many artists who revisited them constantly in search for figural models, for pathos formel. And figures of the sarcophagus inspire characters in works of artists such as Gentile da Fabriano, Raphael, Titian, Poussin, and others. You see here all the variations, including the dead Clytemnestra, which is alive again here, or actually Aegisthus. Here is Aegisthus transformed into this figure, the servant turned around. You see bits and pieces of the Oreste sarcophagus everywhere. But where the Oreste sarcophagus has an incredible afterlife is actually in Spain, because that sarcophagus, the one in the National Archaeological Museum in Madrid, was until the 19th century reused in the Castilian church of Usillos for the burial of a medieval clergyman, of a medieval nobleman. And in that church, there was a very famous council of the Castilian church in 1088, and soon afterwards we see how artists saw the original Oreste sarcophagus and took the figuration to create a series of works at the end of the 11th century, in beginning of the 12th century. The two most famous ones is this capital representing Cain killing Abel, and the tympanon that we will be seeing afterwards. And even if the artists didn't understand the story of what they were looking at, curiously enough, the themes of genealogy, crime, and sacrifice are at the core of the iconography of the three works that we see here. It's almost as if the artist sensed that those themes were ingrained in the images they were looking. But definitely the tympanon, which you see here, very important work in San Isidoro in León, that is the tympanon. Curiously, the tympanon is unquestionably the Romanesque work that shows a more profound artistic engagement with the classical model. The sacrifice of Isaac is situated at the center of the tympanon and expands its narrative to dramatize the theme of genealogy and its implications for salvation history by playing out a contrast between Abraham's two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. From right to left appears Sarah seated in front of the tent house, overseeing the departure of her son Isaac, who we see riding off to Mount Moriah, and next is Isaac removing his shoes to enter the sacred ground where the sacrifice will be performed. And at the center, you see Abraham in the fateful moment when he's stopped by God's injunction. And then to the left is the other part, which is the Abraham's slave concubine Hagar with her son Ishmael, and this double genealogy in the context of the reconquest of Spain has something to do with a political context of attacks on the Islamic part, which were supposed to be the descendants of Hagar. So we see how the elongated field of the tympanum allowed the artist to adopt faithfully the sarcophagus frieze as a compositional blueprint, reproducing closely the posing and positioning of individual figures. So from right to left, we see how the figure of Sarah extended her arms backwards as she turns her head towards the direction of the narrative is a variation of Orestes at Delphi. Isaac, taking off his sandals, recalls the crouching pose of the servant. The figure of Abraham is a clothed version of the central Orestes, as if he had grabbed from the ground the corpse of Clytemnestra, here transformed into Isaac. Then the angel with his right arm crossing over his chest to bring forth the lamb replicates the position of the other Orestes, and Hagar strikes a pose similar to one of the Furies. But moreover, aside from the design and placement of the figures, the Leon artist shows a masterful understanding of the rhythmic cadences of the Roman frieze. In both works, the forceful chiastic center sets off a kinetic reaction that ripples laterally in undulating sequences. The ample curves of the flute, here you see how almost these cloths are similar to this. The lamb here is almost taking the part of this cloth in this connection between the figures that he's building. And at a more subtle level, the tympanum even emulates the narrative technique of the sarcophagus, down to its clever use of a syncopated temporality. There are repetitions of Orestes, and here you have the triple repetition of Isaac moving. Yet the most brilliant artistic and conceptual communion between the tympanum and the sarcophagus occurs in an empty space, the church area where the gaze of the sacrificer meets the hand that tries to stop him, the hand of the nurse. So the hand of the nurse facing Orestes morphs in the tympanum into the hand of God holding Abraham, in a formal translation that amounts to a profound visual meditation containing one gesture on the relationship between ritual murder in Greek myth and biblical sacrifice. And to be sure, how we see here how the Orestes frieze provides not only the formal master image, but also the exegetical meta-narrative behind the Leon tympanum. This is actually a beautiful realization of what Avi Barbour called the iconology of the interval, which is the church meaning of the empty spaces between the figures, and not only the presence of the figures themselves. So let me just now present you what might be the last masterpiece inspired by a phantom image of the Orestes sarcophagus. And let's go through it, and let's see how we find here several coincidences. Characters that start with this kind of like a linear standing figure that then moves into a figure that is crouching, this woman. Then we have this woman that comes out of a window holding a lamp. And here we have the Fury extending her hand, holding a torch and a snake. That is what the Furies are holding here, moving. So we are beginning the movement of the blueprint in the sarcophagus. Here is what I was telling you. The Furies holding the torch, the woman like coming out of the window in a rush also to kind of denounce what is happening. And there we have the same rhythmic disposition towards the left of the sarcophagus, with the two figures moving in that direction, the horse, Orestes, the nurse, the bull. And here, there is a detail that is you can hardly see in the original Guernica. Is a bird that is almost sacrificing. And curiously, is exactly what you have in the hand of the nurse. There you have the transformation that occurs with the figure of the dead Aegisthus, as in blueprints of works of art, as we saw in Gentile da Fabriano that turns around the Pathos Formel. This is what happens here. Let's turn it around. And at the end of the Guernica, we see this entanglement of the hind, the legs of the horse and parts of the stool and the dead soldier. And let's just follow the lines here. Here, 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 here. It's almost as if you have the blueprint there inscribed. And here you have in the Guernica the mother with an exposed breast screaming. It's almost as if you bring Clytemnestra that is represented with her breast, because she actually shows Orestes before killing her breast to kind of like say, I'm your mother, don't kill me. So it's important, the exposed breast. And here one of the most haunting images of the Guernica, which is the screaming mother with the baby. So Picasso used to say of his paintings, how can you expect an onlooker to leave a painting as I left it? A picture comes to me from miles away. Who is to say from how far away I sensed it, saw it, painted it, and yet the next day I can't see what I've done myself? How can anyone enter into my dreams, my instinct, my desires, my thoughts, which have taken a long time to mature and to come out into daylight, and above all grasp from them what I have been about, perhaps against my own will? So what is the afterlife of an image like this in Picasso's mind, like the Oreste Sarcophagus, in his unconscious? How does the final version of Guernica slides onto a blueprint that might have been impressed in his mind and be retrieved instinctively when facing with a theme of fratricidal violence, interfamilial conflict, exile, rage, and revenge? So let us delve briefly for that in the archaeology of the ruins of Picasso's homeland and Picasso's own biography in relation to antiquity. At age 9, Picasso made the drawing that you see on screen. This is a small figure of Hercules that stood in the corridor of his father's house in Malaga. So proud was the boy of his accomplishments that he signed the work, as you see there, Pablo Ruiz Picasso, Noviembre 1890, and often mentioned it later in life as an example of his artistic precociousness. It was a very important drawing for him. The model he copied that day was probably a replica of one of the bronze statues from the series of the 12 Labors of Hercules produced by Gian Bologna in 1580. And he kept the drawing all his life and often mentioned it as an example of this artistic talent. And thus, in that way, he constructed his own legend as an artist on this primordial exercise of pictorial apprehension of the figure of a Greek hero wrestling violent with an invisible enemy. So by retrospectively declaring this drawing to be his first, he could flaunt his early mastery over the classical tradition and at the same time establish a personal identification with his subject, an embodiment of the drive and agonic struggle to succeed through energetic acts of destruction. And as you saw, he conceives his painting as a sum of destructions. Indeed, it seems that for Picasso, the labor of artistic creation had something of the agonic wrestling of the labors of Hercules, constantly trying to subdue creatures of shape-shifting powers like the multi-headed Inescurulus, Lernia Hydra. But really, the monster he had to be dealing with and fighting against his whole life was the one in another labor of Hercules, Cerberus, the vicious beast that guarded the entrance to Hades, the underworld, and that kept the living from entering the underworld, the world of the dead. And it is soon after this where Picasso will have an encounter with death and an encounter with antiquity that will be haunting for him during his whole life. After Malaga, at age 10, he moved to La Coruña in Galicia, very close to Santiago de Compostela. And there is when he had very important 4 formative years in his life, where he started drawing in the art school directed by his father, and where something horrendous happened for him, which was the death of his younger sister, Conchita. It was a blonde girl full of life that he saw her wither away with diphtheria. So his mother told him to pray. And Picasso promised to God that he would make the ultimate sacrifice, giving up that which he loved most, drawing, if his sister recovered. But she passed away, and as if setting out Picasso on a relentless escape from death, he never stopped drawing. In fact, Picasso, in his deathbed, he asked for a pencil to draw. So death and antiquity are very connected in this moment in Picasso in La Coruña, because what he did, as in all art schools, was drawing classical sculptures and plaster casts. And in this moment, he could have had actually his first encounter with the Oreste Sarcophagus, because there was this very famous 19th century art publication with engravings, like the one you see on a screen, that was basically in all the art schools in Spain. And this is a drawing by Picasso, and this is the engraving of the Oreste Sarcophagus in that publication. But then, in that publication, he would have had the first encounter with something that is also a source of inspiration for his art, which is like non-Occidental works of art. And then soon afterwards, he moved to Barcelona, but in '95, he stopped in Madrid, and he visited the Prado for the first time. And probably he visited also the Archaeological Museum, where the Oreste Sarcophagus was exhibited. He goes back to Madrid several times when he was living in Barcelona. And in 1901, a very important moment happens for him in Madrid. He was living in a street very close to the National Archaeological Museum, and he was studying in the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, and it is there where death also happens for him. And his dear friend, another painter, Casa Gemas, committed suicide, and he started that actually plunged him into a depression and set off the blue period with this one of these masterpieces dedicated to the death of Casa Gemas, which is La Vie. And when he was living next to the Archaeological Museum in Madrid, here is how the Oreste Sarcophagus was displayed. So let us imagine the little Picasso, small Picasso, and then grown up Picasso, going this as some scholars call him a visual kleptomaniac, going to the National Archaeological Museum and looking at the Oreste Sarcophagus. It's impossible that this really incredibly beautiful work of art and very, very strong didn't appeal to him. And actually he could find there his little Hercules. Because if you turn Hercules around, the embodiment of Picasso, even to the end of his life, the foundational drawing of who he was as an artist is actually a combination of the two Orestes. If you put them together, and actually someone so visually attuned like Picasso couldn't have missed that. So let's just approach the painting of Guernica. during the going up to the Spanish Civil War, Picasso was kind of like in a moment of engaging with classicism. He was commissioned what is called the Vilar suite, which is a series of classically inspired etchings, as in this case, where he's representing himself as the sculpture and the recumbent model in the figure of Hercules again. He's embodying Hercules. Also, it is in that period which he was actually dealing with some emotional turmoil. He was in his mid-50s. He starts also projecting himself on the figure of the Minotaur, and also in relation to wrestling with death and with blindness, that for him was very connected. Going up to the Civil War in Spain and to the making of Guernica, he starts bringing together some themes that will be taken up in the creation of Guernica, such as the famous Minotauromachy, where everything that I was telling you about in relation to death and antiquity come together. The image of the blind Minotaur, the image of the little girl, that is, as many scholars refer to, almost a recollection of his dead sister, Conchita, acting like a lamp in this kind of phantasmagoric world. So the Civil War breaks out, and Madrid starts to be bombed, including the museums, and there is destruction everywhere. On the one hand, the anarchist militias that are uncontrollable until the Republican government is able to control them. And on the other hand, the destruction brought up by the bombings from the air raids of the Franco military. And in that moment, you see the efforts of the Republican government against the anarchist militias, explaining them with these posters that they shouldn't destroy sacred images, because it's not that they are a source of religion, but they are works of art that they belong to their heritage. They should not see them as horrible representatives of the religion that is oppressive, but they are works of art and they shouldn't destroy them. And at the same time, they start the evacuation in the fall of 1937 of the Prado Museum. It is at this moment where the Director General of Fine Arts of the Republic, here, Josep Renau, has the wonderful idea of naming Picasso the director of the Prado Museum in absentia. And Picasso at that point said, now they all belong to me. Finally, this visual kleptomaniac, absorbing everything in the Spanish tradition, finally owned them all, and they all depended on him. But the thing is that the ironic part of it is that he never went back to Madrid, and he was basically the director of the Phantom Museum, because he was director of an empty museum, because in this incredible operation put up by the Spanish Republic, they packed up all the holdings of the Prado Museum and brought them to Valencia, where the Republican government have been transferred due to the fact that Madrid was constantly under siege. You see at that time bombs going down on the museum, National Archaeological Museum, and this is photographs taken by the Republic as propaganda to send to the international nations to ask for aid to preserve their cultural heritage. It is at this moment also when Josep Renau, now at the beginning of 1937, goes to Paris and commissions Picasso to paint the Guernica for the Spanish pavilion in the World Exhibition of Paris that was supposed to open that summer. And at that moment, Picasso, in January 1937, just taking sides against Franco, he starts creating this etching, this comic etching, in which, in order to sell them and to get funds to aid the Spanish Republic. And they are called the Dream or in lie of Franco, and they represent Franco as this monstrous hybrid that kind of like this, kills the horse he's riding, and you know, produces all this sort of wreckage on symbols of Spain. But I want you to look at this specific, the beginning of the comic strip. And this is none other than, I think not coincidentally, the incredible sculptures of, oh my God, what is the name of this hybrid? Sphinx, the sphinxes that are in the entrance of the National Archaeological Museum that you saw there. So Picasso had the National Archaeological Museum very much in mind, and when he decided to portray Franco as a destroyer of heritage, it was the Sphinx representing the National Archaeological Museum what was in his mind. The National Archaeological Museum, and not the Prado, because there it was the headquarters of this whole operation to inventory works of art, was for him the headquarters of the archaeological memory of Spain. And here you see again Franco represented almost like a Hydrian Lernaean Hydra as one of the, again, one of the labors of Hercules, as if now what just completely enraged Picasso for the destroyal of the cultural heritage where he belongs, just like takes on openly against Franco internationally. So during the months from when he gets the commission for the painting for the Spanish Pavilion in January until April, Picasso doesn't have any brilliant idea for what to paint. He basically creates a series of paintings of the artist's studio, such as the one we saw where he presents himself as Hercules. But then the bombing of Guernica occurs in April 27. And there he receives, he sees the photographs in all the international newspapers, and suddenly he just knows that is the Guernica should be the theme of his painting. And soon afterwards, he starts drawing. And you have these drawings of May the 1st, 1937, where you see some of the themes that will go into Guernica. In the third drawing that he does that day, you see the classical themes in the painting. There is almost like a Greek soldier, almost like destroyed, like if it was a Greek statue to represent the destruction of cultural heritage. And the horse that you will see in Guernica, a little Pegasus comes out of the womb as a revival of this classical motif. And you see the bull, obviously, this relationship with himself and with Spain, and the woman coming out of the window. And see how he starts moving things around. Now the Greek statue becomes more like an actual soldier, and these main aspects remain there. In these drawings, in the next days, he just goes back to projecting himself on some of the characters. And as he saw himself as the Minotaur, and for many scholars, the bull could represent Spain, even if it's a bull that destroys also. In the context of Guernica is the act of destruction, this double side of the destroyer and victim, also present in Picasso's embodiment of Minotaur. You see here how he presents his features. And then starts the huge canvas in his studio in Paris. And we know the evolution of the canvas because of the photographs taken by Dora Maar. And you see how that coincides exactly in date with the efforts of packing up all the works in the National Archaeological Museum. And as he was painting Guernica, he was receiving news of the efforts in Madrid to preserve and pack up works of art. So imagine him in his huge studio in Paris, receiving letters from Madrid of what was being doing there. And this is, I told you how it was the main word, the Oreste Sarcophagus packed. So imagine this double frame, what was happening in May in Paris and in Madrid. Josep Renau, the Director General of Fine Arts, who had commissioned the Guernica, telling him about what was happening. And see this parallel view of Picasso painting this huge canvas where there are all these like piled up pathos formel in which he absorbs basically the representation of the destruction of Spain through the assemblage of figures that might be related to works that are important for the cultural heritage of Spain, and how the sculptures from the National Archaeological Museum are actually reassembled as in a three-dimensional Barburgian Mnemosyne panel with one of the main ones, the Dama de Elche there. See Picasso working tirelessly. And see the famous figure that we saw, that we related to Aegisthus. This is a figure in which Picasso had a lot of trouble. As you see, the head was facing frontally, as in the sarcophagus. And here you see another moment of this Picasso's visual kleptomania related to Spanish art in hidden places. And this is an 11th century manuscript of the Comment on the Apocalypse by the Spanish monk Beatus of Liébana that was on exhibition in Paris, and he saw it. And in this destruction, this is a representation of the flood. He takes the head of the figure to actually transform this other figure. So that important figure that started as a Greek warrior in the original drawing was transformed completely through the blueprint of the dead Aegisthus and then pasted on with another part, bits and pieces of the national heritage of Spain. So let's just conclude and go back to the Fog Museum. So as we saw in this series of drawings, as the iconographic traces of the classical figures disappear, the composition of the Guernica realigns itself more clearly onto the blueprint of the Oreste Sarcophagus, as if it was unconsciously coming into view before our eyes as a process of artistic creation ex novo. But here I argue was suggested by the artist in his own in the sense that he had that image imprinted in his mind when facing with this theme of tragedy and interfamiliar conflict. And really, if we go to the Fog, to enter Guernica is to plunge in tragedy's relentless cycle of survival. Here at the Barbo Room of the Fog, Guernica is a painting in exile, but it is also a painting of exile, in that it is a painting constructed as an assemblage of exiled pathos formel subjected to a relentless displacement. Forms and emotions slide constantly into each other, never settling on a static image. And in fact, we can say that stylistically, Guernica is classicism exiled in the land of Cubism. And that is actually why Guernica is saved from kitsch, because many people could attack the painting as is a narrative Cubist painting. It's not really Cubism, but the painting works, and it could have not worked if the blueprint, I argue, of the Oreste Sarcophagus didn't come to mind to realign precisely those spaces where a painting might be destroyed or might be created, or you can create a horrible kitsch painting, or you can create a haunting masterpiece that keeps giving. And also, we can add that exile is the organizing and the operating principle of Guernica, also on a personal level. As an artist, Picasso is always an artist in permanent exile, restless, constantly changing styles, and the fatherland from which his exile is the classical tradition. And that is the tradition he learns from his father in his infancy in Malaga and in A Coruña. And that is the fatherland is connected to familial tragedy and to his encounter with death, from which he tried to escape all his life. So for him, his fatherland, his patria, the patria that was being destroyed again during the Civil War in an interfamilial Cainite conflict, was represented in the archaeological remains of Spain, specifically, I would argue, in the Oreste Sarcophagus. So we see how here Picasso does a reconfiguration of the classical tradition as a form of creation that results from an act of destruction. He's really, in relation to Guernica and to the pictorial tradition he's being inspired by, almost in relation to Spain and what was the tragedy he was seen from afar, he's almost like Orestes, returning to his homeland in Guernica after his exile, and there in a rage, engaging in an act of destruction, which is why he's also, it's so difficult to pinpoint a specific symbolism in the images of Guernica, of the painting, because the bull is an act of destruction, but it's also an embodiment of Spain and of Picasso himself. And I think we should leave it here because I think I'm over time, right? Very much so. I'll just finally, I left Madinat al-Zahra, so in the background, just to tell you that obviously Picasso was Andalusian, and the tradition of Al-Andalus was very much in his mind. This is a painting, an early painting he did when he was still a teenager of a man as an Arab. Yeah, let's leave it at that, because if not, I would extend myself too much, I think. Thank you very much.
Are there questions for Pablo? Are there questions in the chat?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. There's one. Okay.
No, I just would like you to thank you for the first talk. It's extremely fascinating, and I learned a lot. And I just wanted to add, when you were discussing the part about the sister dying and that he took the quest to paint as a way to escape death, would you expand more on that? Like, what was his relationship to the idea of painting and mortality?
Yeah, so I think it was very important. I mean, this period, because we also think about Picasso, think about Barcelona, where he moved, and his father moved there, and there it started basically entering modernity, and then in Paris. But this 4-year period in La Coruña is very important, in this city in the Atlantic, because as I told you, he starts basically being formed as an artist. He was a teenager, 13, 14 years old. And at that moment, and this is not something that people analyze, but Picasso himself says it, the death of his sister was absolutely shocking for him. You know, we all experience with the death of a loved person, suddenly we realize that we are mortals, which is stupid to think, because obviously everyone knows that we are mortals. But I think it's when someone really close to you dies. But that, in the case of Picasso, is associated very closely to the powers he thought he had as an artist. Very soon, started in Malaga, he knew that he had gifts for drawing. You know, that would make him powerful as a person. He was the little Hercules, someone who can actually, through his drawing and through his art, control the world around him. So as I told you in this anecdote related to the fact that, you know, his mother told him to pray so his sister would live, and that he made that vow that he would stop drawing, because for him that was the ultimate sacrifice if his sister lived, but she didn't. And I think there was there a breakage, almost this entering death, and the fact that he shouldn't stop. In Picasso, I think there is an interior drive as an artist, but that type of drive goes beyond artistic quest, and there is something emotional and personal. And Picasso is the most prolific artist almost of the 20th century, never stopped drawing, even I think one day in his life, and he dated everything. And I think because there is this connection, when you draw, when you are in a constant process of creation, you are running away from death, because death is the contrary, is ecstasy, is finitude. And when you are creating new things, you are moving, and death doesn't catch up with you. So and another incredible moment of encounter with death was the death of Casa Gemas. I mean, the paintings he did, you know, portrayals of the deceased Casa Gemas with the wound of the gun with which he committed suicide. He did several paintings inspired in classical Spanish paintings, such as The Burial of the Count of Orgaz by El Greco. He did a remake of El Greco's Burial of the Count of Orgaz, represented the burial of Casa Gemas, and that starts how important it is death in connection to his art, that set off the blue period for him. So I think death and destruction has a lot to do with it, and everything comes together in the Civil War, because he was very much at that point a little disengaged with Spain. I mean, he didn't even take sides really at the beginning of the Civil War. It was only when he got this commission, when he actively saw the destruction of cultural heritage, maybe some words very dear to who he was, that he decided to take on a political stance on the Civil War, and that is the Guernica.
Well, thank you very much for an excellent, beautiful lecture. And I wanted to ask if you can just briefly walk us a bit through other explanations that exist in the past about the composition, because this is it's very compelling. I presume it's a very new take on the sarcophagus, but like what were other views throughout the decades?
Yeah.
And then a second question is if you can expand a bit more about the Andalus and his Malaga childhood, and to what extent I see that you might have some other slides, and maybe you can in case there's more time, just to explore a bit this connection, which I think for the whole audience will be interesting.
Yes, wonderful question. No, there are actually many studies on Guernica pinpointing actually models in paintings by Poussin, and you actually see them by Proudhon. For example, the woman coming out of the window, you see something really similar, which brings to the fore the fact that that concept of the visual kleptomaniac, that Picasso was basically putting together, apparently, obviously, a huge storage of images in his mind. And some of them are less obvious than, more obvious than others. The Guernica was very interestingly connected to the shape of Roman sarcophagi by several scholars, including T.J. Clark, but not looking at a specific model, but seeing how curious it was that the way Guernica is presented in this Elogentem format, and there is a tragedy of multiple figures there, was connected to Roman sarcophagi, because Roman sarcophagi are an incredible source of dissemination of classical myth and pathos formel, because they were produced in Rome as an industry. That is why you have many Oreste sarcophagi that are almost the same. But as we say Oreste sarcophagi, we say Meleager sarcophagi, Gates of Hades sarcophagi, and they were distributed all over the Mediterranean. So as you saw in Spain, just one sarcophagus can set off and appear from a Romanesque tympanum to a capital of a church. So, but no one had actually shown that there might be an actual sarcophagus behind the Guernica that Picasso had very much in mind. Although I don't want to fall, because Picasso is too big an artist to do facile quotations. So my argument is that there is no doubt in my mind that Picasso saw the Oreste sarcophagus and that the Oreste sarcophagus in Madrid was very important to him. It's just absolutely, if you go to Madrid and you don't know anything about the classical tradition, you go to the National Archaeological Museum, and that is one of the work that catches your eye. Imagine for Picasso, someone who is able to draw the classical tradition and who was looking for that. It's impossible that he did not see it, starting with that. But I think it's too facile and too literal to think, oh my God, the Oreste sarcophagus, let me just turn around the figure of Aegisthus. I think it was more automatic. When you are a writer, you obviously write building on all the things you read all your life. And there is a moment in which you can do a metaphoric construction that comes to your mind and you don't even remember the source where you read it in bits and pieces. And I think that is why the Oreste sarcophagus, in this process of him making this incredible canvas work, because he did many changes, suddenly automatically, maybe he turns around that figure and it works for him. And he doesn't realize that is because he saw it working in that Oreste sarcophagus. But I think the blueprint totally aided him to save Guernica from kitsch. That is my argument. And to make Guernica an everlasting masterpiece, which is what actually happened for the artist, the medieval artist, in their dialogue with the sarcophagus without understanding what they were looking at. But for some reason, and that is why the methodological framework of Avi Warburg is so interesting, because he saw the copy of figures from the classical tradition into Western art also as an automatic process, because these figures had with them in their gestural composition ingrained an emotional charge that could be interpreted even if you don't know the theme of the original narrative context to which they belong. And it's curious how the artists in the Middle Ages, they take the images which in the classical tradition represent a fratricidal, genocidal narrative of a spilling of family blood for exactly those themes in biblical history, Cain killing Abel and the sacrifice of Isaac. And then Picasso does the same with the Spanish Civil War, which was a fratricidal war. It's almost as if that moment, the Oreste sarcophagus came to his mind. And in relation, the thing with the Andalusian, the Andalusian part for Picasso is really confusing in the sense that I don't know there is much relation with what is the Islamic cultural production other than with the already Spanish tradition of Andalusia, which is bullfighting. And, I don't think it went back that much to appreciating the Islamic heritage for what it was at the moment. The ruins of Maternal, Sahara, there are these wonderful photographs. I just take them. It's like these early visitors to Madinat, Sahara at the beginning of the 20th century weren't really known when Picasso was there. They knew that there were ruins next to Cordoba, but people hadn't associated them to the famous city built by Abdurrahman III. They thought that they were different ruins. I just brought them here because there is also where you find Roman sarcophagi everywhere. They were reused for fountains. So the classical tradition permeates all the Mediterranean. Yeah, taking advantage of the silence, I'm just going to show you a very curious aftermath. So he finishes the Guernica for the Spanish pavilion in the early summer of 1937. So the efforts of the Spanish Republic in preserving cultural heritage continue. In the Spanish Republic, the government in the middle of the war, already in Valencia, they published notable archaeological discoveries that they did while fighting in the trenches, in order to show the world that they were not barbarians, that they were actually, as they fought for civilization, they were taking care of cultural heritage. And this was published in September 1937. And one of the big discoveries they did is this lamp, this Roman lamp that they discovered in the trenches outside Madrid. And they publish it as this wonderful work of art. You see how curious that the lamp has the two main characters of the Guernica, the bull and the horse. So, you know, if we wanted to bring scholarship into a creative montage with artistic creation, we could do an archaeological intervention on Guernica and light the lamp there, right? Anyway, this is just a silly game.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Francisco.
you.
I want to give you a small
Oh my
gift
God.
to leave with. This concludes the two-day book launch of Thinking Through Ruins, and it's a project with the working group Common Challenges, Common Heritage at the Arab Academy, German Young Academy, Agya. I want to thank you all. I want to thank you, Zavina, the director, for being with us, for their support, the Agya team. I want to thank my co-editors. Thank you for all the work, and Danny, Konstantin Klein, who couldn't be with us, but who has a wonderful article in this book, Barbara Winkler. Thank you so much. And mostly thank you for all the participants for producing incredible pieces during these very, very strange and difficult times. Thank you again, Francisco. Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you.